If you fell asleep with this disease, you probably woke up dead. Yes, history somehow made napping medically suspicious. In 1485, England, that was not a joke. It was basically the worst bedtime warning ever written. Picture a man waking in late medieval England. Candle smoke inside, dirty streets outside, rats considering legal action. At first, he just feels off. Warm, dizzy, nothing dramatic, because medieval England made terrible feel normal. Then the sweating starts. Not normal sweating, more like his body ran a marathon without asking permission. Within minutes, his clothes are soaked. Within an hour, he is shaking like history just found the thermostat. And then fear arrives. Not reasonable fear, but sudden crushing dread, like the brain opened a disaster folder. His heart pounds, his head throbs, and his body burns through water like it wants to become a raisin. Then he gets tired. Wait, harmless, right? No? With English sweating sickness, sleepiness was the shutdown warning. Doctors noticed something horrifying. Patients who stayed awake sometimes survived. Patients who fell asleep often did not wake up. So families tried to keep the sick awake, which is a loving gesture and also medieval nightmare fuel. Imagine being drenched in sweat, shaking, terrified, half delirious, while someone stands over you yelling, "Do not nap." Welcome to the English sweating sickness, history's worst excuse to skip sleep, and somehow still not the weirdest disease here. It first appeared in 1485, right as England crawled out of the War of the Roses, and nobody knew where it came from, which historically is when the confident guessing begins immediately. Some blame soldiers. Some blame the French because apparently that was a very convenient medieval hobby. Some blame the stars because why blame germs when you can accuse the entire sky? At one point, the explanation was basically, Mars is acting suspicious, very scientific, very useless. To be fair, medieval England was not exactly a clean operating room. The streets were filthy, and the water was questionable. The air was so bad it probably could have been sliced, plated, and served with suspicious bread. So doctors leaned on miasma theory, the idea that disease spread through dirty, corrupt air. Was that right? No. Was it confident? Absolutely. History loves confidence, especially when everyone nearby is dying. But the symptoms were the real nightmare. Sudden sweating, violent chills, crushing anxiety, pounding headaches, heart palpitations, and thirst. Not, I could use a drink thirst, more like drying from the inside out. And all of this could happen fast, not weeks, not days, hours. History was apparently speed-running medical terror. Some accounts describe people dying in as little as 3 hours after symptoms began. 3 hours. That is barely enough time to watch a bad movie and regret the popcorn. Medieval disease had terrible pacing. If you survived the first 24 hours, your chances improved. The problem was surviving that first day. The estimated fatality rate was brutal, around 30 to 50%. Basically, history handed you a coin. One side was life, the other side was a very damp funeral. Not exactly a fair game. And this was not a one-time visit. The sweating sickness returned again and again between 1485 and 1551. Like a horrible sequel nobody ordered, it kept coming back because apparently one nightmare was not enough. The worst outbreak hit in 1528 and spread across much of Europe, dragging panic with it. Except, weirdly, France. Which is funny because some people blame the French for the whole thing. History enjoys sarcasm. It does not always help, but it definitely commits to the bit. But the strangest detail was who it seemed to hit hardest. Healthy, wealthy, middle-aged men. Most epidemics usually crush the weak first. The poor, the malnourished, the very young, and the very old. This disease did not follow the script. Records suggest it hit healthy, wealthy, middle-aged men especially hard. If you were comfortable, social, and doing well, the disease apparently took that personally. The theory is simple. Wealthy men gathered more, traveled more, socialized more, and spent time indoors together. Basically, they were networking themselves into the grave, which is the worst business meeting outcome imaginable. Still, there is something deeply unsettling about an illness walking into the strongest room and picking the richest guy first. And then there was the sleep. The sweating was horrible. The chills were horrible. The thirst was horrible. But sleep was the edge of the cliff. Your body begged for it while your family fought against it. Your doctor feared it too, because once that drowsiness arrived, the body might already be shutting down. And the worst part? We still do not know exactly what caused the English sweating sickness. There are theories: hantavirus, influenza-like illness, something environmental, or something simply lost to time. No confirmed answer, which means this was not just a disease. It was a mystery with terrible timing. It killed people before they even had time to ask the right question. Very rude. Very historical. And if sweating yourself to death sounds terrible, Mexico was about to make things much, much wetter. The English sweating sickness made the body overheat. Cocoliztli made the body look like it was trying to escape. Mexico, mid-1500s. The Aztec Empire had fallen, and Spanish conquest had shattered the region. Smallpox had already carved through indigenous populations with devastating force. Then, around 1545, something worse appeared. The locals called it Cocoliztli, roughly pestilence. Not poetic, very accurate. At first, it looked ordinary enough. Fever, headache, weakness, dizziness, the usual starter pack for disaster. Then it escalated fast. The fever climbed, the pain sharpened, and dizziness turned into confusion. And then the body started leaking, blood from the nose, mouth, and eyes. History stopped being subtle, sometimes from places nobody wants listed in a sentence. Which is fair. Some details deserve privacy. This was not a quiet illness. This was the body waving every red flag it owned. Victims could suffer intense abdominal and chest pain, swelling, and severe bleeding before dying within days. Sometimes it moved so quickly that treatment barely had time to become useless, which is a horrifying sentence, and the scale was catastrophic. Cocoliztli killed millions, not as a footnote, but as a civilization-level wound. Some estimates place the death toll between 12 and 15 million during the first major outbreak. Entire communities were gutted. Families vanished. A civilization already wounded by conquest was hit again by something invisible. The Spanish were affected too. But indigenous people suffered far more severely because disease never strikes in a vacuum. Forced labor, malnutrition, displacement, and collapsing social systems pushed people right to the edge. And disease loves the edge. It loves weakness, crowded misery, and populations already running on fumes. At the time, people searched for explanations. Divine punishment, foreign disease, bad air, the environment. The stars probably got blamed too, because apparently the sky was everyone's favorite suspect. Modern researchers still debate what Cocoliztli actually was. Some theories point to a hemorrhagic fever. Others suggest Salmonella enterica, based on genetic evidence from ancient remains. Others look at drought, rodents, and collapse. The most honest answer is simple: we do not fully know. And that uncertainty is part of the horror, because the obvious story would be, the Spanish brought the disease, and it destroyed the population. But wait, Cocoliztli may be more complicated. It may have been local, waiting for the perfect disaster. Conquest, famine, drought, and social breakdown may have created the conditions for something hidden to explode. And when those conditions arrived, it erased millions. Not dramatically, efficiently, which is worse. The treatments were desperate. Herbal medicines, bloodletting, spiritual healing, quarantine attempts, and prayer. Some efforts may have helped around the edges. Most could not stop the collapse, because you cannot fight what you cannot identify. And Cocoliztli refused to be understood. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Sweating sickness was fast, strange, and terrifying. Cocoliztli was violent, massive, and mysterious. Different continents, different symptoms, same human problem. Nobody knew what was happening. And when people do not understand death, they fill the empty space fast. With blame, with stories, with confidence. Sometimes comforting, sometimes dangerous, and usually delivered very loudly. But if bleeding from everywhere feels like the worst thing a body can do, wait. The next disease does not make you bleed. It does not make you sweat. It makes you laugh. And that is where the horror becomes personal. Kuru does not hit like a storm. It creeps, slowly, patiently, like the nervous system is being stalked from the inside. Papua New Guinea, the Highlands, a remote society known as the Four People. For generations, the Foray lived with traditions outsiders barely understood. One of them was endocannibalism. Yes, human consumption, but not the cartoon version. This was ritual, mourning, and a way to honor the dead. To outsiders, it was shocking. To the Four, it was meaningful, tied to grief, memory, and staying connected. Unfortunately, biology does not care how meaningful something is, especially when brain tissue is involved. Because inside some of those brains was not a virus, not bacteria, not a parasite. It was a protein. Yes, a protein, which sounds harmless enough to be sold in a gym tub. Proteins build muscle, repair cells, keep the body running, and get advertised by men yelling beast mode. But when certain proteins fold the wrong way, they can become prions. And prions are terrifying. They can make other proteins fold wrong too. One broken biological instruction corrupting the next. Inside the brain, that is a disaster. The disease was called Kuru, and its infamous symptom was laughter. Not joyful laughter, not great joke laughter, uncontrolled laughter, the kind that makes the room go quiet. At first, symptoms were subtle. A stumble, a twitch, a headache, a little loss of balance. Nothing that screams apocalypse. Just small wrong signals, the kind a family might explain away at first. Then the body begins losing its argument with the brain. Walking gets harder. Hands shake. Coordination fails. The person changes emotionally. Fear, anxiety, aggression, confusion, and sudden mood swings. Then comes the laughter. And imagine how horrifying that is when nothing in the room is funny. Someone you love is laughing, but the person behind the face is slipping away. That is not comedy. That is horror wearing a smile. And history really did not need that visual. The earlier diseases were brutal but fast. Kuru was not merciful enough to hurry. Victims deteriorated over months, sometimes around a year, as the brain slowly lost control. Eventually, they could not stand. Then they could not speak properly. Then eating and drinking became dangerous. Many died because the body lost the coordination needed to swallow. Survival became a task the brain could not manage. That is a terrifying way to disappear. Not suddenly, but piece by piece, function by function. And because of 4 funeral rolls, women and children were often affected most. They were more likely to prepare and consume certain parts of the body, including brain tissue. That gave them greater exposure. A ritual meant to express love became a transmission route. Good intentions, terrible outcome. Biology, again, refusing to respect the emotional context. Researchers eventually linked Kuru to prions in the 1950s. As funeral practices declined, the disease faded. But prion diseases have a cruel trick. They can incubate for years, even decades, quietly. A person can carry the future quietly. No symptoms, no warning, just a biological clock ticking in the brain, which is incredibly rude behavior for a disease. And even today, prion diseases have no cure once symptoms begin. That is what makes Kuru feel so modernly frightening. Fast zombies are fiction. Misfolded proteins are real. And real is worse. By now, the pattern is clearer. Each disease attacked a different kind of safety. Sweating sickness attacked sleep. Cocoliztli attacked the body. Kuru attacked identity itself. Movement, personality, emotion, speech, all stripped away. And history still had one absurd nightmare left. Because next, an entire city started dancing, and apparently forgot how to stop. The dancing plague sounds fake, which is impressive after death naps, blood leaks, and criminal proteins. But this one had a rhythm. Strasbourg, 1518, was absolutely not ready for a public health crisis with choreography. One summer day, a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into the street and began to dance. At first, strange, not catastrophic. Cities are full of strange people doing strange things. But then she kept going. Hour after hour. Day after day. Exhaustion paused her. Then she started again. Imagine being her neighbor, opening a window for ordinary medieval misery. Goat, bad bread, maybe taxes. Instead, Frau Trophea is outside dancing like her skeleton signed a contract with Satan. Then other people joined. Not one or two, dozens, then more. Soon, Strasbourg had streets full of people dancing like their bodies had been hijacked by invisible music. And this was not joyful dancing. Not a festival, not a wedding, not medieval Coachella with plague fleas. Witnesses described panic, exhaustion, empty faces, torn feet, and muscles failing under the command. They looked less like dancers and more like prisoners trapped inside a command their bodies refused to cancel. By the peak, hundreds may have been involved. That is no longer a strange afternoon. That is a city-wide nightmare. So officials did what officials often do in history. Gathered, debated, became extremely confident, and chose badly. Doctors decided the dancers had hot blood, which sounds less like diagnosis and more like confused Uncle Science. The proposed cure? Dance it out. Yes, people collapsing from dancing were told to dance harder. So the city cleared spaces, built stages, and hired musicians. Because apparently the crisis needed production value. People were already dancing themselves into collapse. And the government response was, what if we improve the venue? That is not medicine. That is event planning. And somehow, it made the situation worse. Now the dancers had space, music, and an audience. Strasbourg accidentally upgraded panic into a cursed talent show. People collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, and bodies pushed beyond their limits. Dancing is fun for 10 minutes, 30 if the song is excellent. Days? Weeks? That is slow-motion self-destruction with choreography. Eventually, officials changed tactics. The remaining dancers were sent away for religious treatment, prayer, rituals, cleansing, and the outbreak faded. Maybe that helped psychologically. Maybe it had already run its course. Nobody knows for sure. Modern theories include mass psychogenic illness, extreme stress spreading through a group as physical symptoms, and Strasbourg had stress, famine, disease, poverty, religious fear, and the medieval problem of no antibiotics. Another theory is ergotism, poisoning from fungus-contaminated rye. In other words, very bad bread. Not this sandwich tastes weird bad. More like, congratulations, your lunch may contain hallucinations and convulsions. Maybe ergot, maybe mass panic, maybe religious fear, maybe hunger, maybe all of it at once. That uncertainty is why the story still sticks. Maybe bad bread, maybe panic, maybe hunger. History refuses to pick one. Sweating sickness made sleep dangerous. Cocoliztli made bodies bleed like they were falling apart. Kuru turned mourning into neurological death. Strasbourg turned panic into movement. 4 outbreaks, 4 nightmares, and 1 shared truth. The scariest part was not always the symptom. It was the explanation. When people do not understand what is killing them, they do not calmly wait for better evidence. They invent a story. Bad air, angry stars, divine punishment, hot blood, evil spirits, bad bread. Foreigners, neighbors, anyone, anything. The human brain hates blank space, so it fills it with nonsense, especially with nonsense. It is easy to laugh at the past, and honestly, the past does make it tempting. Doctors blaming planets, officials hiring musicians for a dance plague, people thinking disease came from cursed air. But wait, are we really that different? Every era has invisible threats, panic, and loud, confident explanations. The costumes change. The fear does not. That is why these diseases still feel disturbing. Not just because they were deadly. Not just because they were weird. Because they show helplessness. A body becomes a mystery and society becomes desperate for answers, even bad ones. A man in a dark English room sweats, shakes, and fights sleep while his family panics. A family in Mexico watches someone bleed from places blood should never come from. A 4-woman laughs as her nervous system collapses, and everyone realizes nothing is funny. A Strasbourg street fills with people dancing on ruined feet, trapped inside a command nobody understands. History is full of kings, wars, empires, and dramatic men wearing too much metal. But sometimes the thing that changes everything is smaller, invisible, patient, and uninterested in your explanation. So next time you feel feverish, tired, or see someone dancing alone in public, do not panic. Probably. But maybe, just maybe, give the bread a suspicious little glance.